Now I'm rich. Hey, where is my money going? Stop. Stop. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. Sometimes, we fail to grasp the effect certain events will have on our lives. Back then, I was blissfully unaware of the goings-on in our little town. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The whole shit show started about 6 months ago. Before the Faceless Man was even called that, nobody would have guessed that a few bizarre incidents could develop into a string of murders. I guess I should start with the first time I heard about the whole ordeal, an otherwise normal afternoon. A full day of sorting letters at my dead-end job at the post office left me tired and depleted as I was watching the long shadows of the trees zoom by on my way home. So why do you think he does that? Huh? I tore my gaze from the car window and tried to focus on what my dearest friend and colleague, Claire, was saying. Why do you think he moves the bodies? Who? The guy. The guy on the news. Still no idea what you're talking about, see? Claire let out a comical sigh. Matt, how can you be so oblivious to the world? I'm talking about that murderer who moves the bodies after he kills them. They found another one last night. It was on the radio this morning. The early dusk light shining through the windshield and illuminating her auburn hair made for quite the picture. I don't listen to the radio and I don't read the paper. Really? Anyways, I think he does it because he's one of those new age folks who hate tradition. And he just took it way too far. Don't you think? She went on. I mean, maybe he's right. If you think about it, spot burying is pretty stupid. I guess there's something I should tell you about the town I live in. It's a mid-sized town in the United States with a population of roughly 20,000. You've probably never heard of it. We don't like strangers too much, and not too many people come to visit. We do have a story though. When the settlement was first established, the original founder, who must have been the biggest prick of the 18th century, instructed the then inhabitants to bury him at the spot where he drew his last breath. George Vancouver the son passed, and was buried in the town hall, and it became common practice to follow in his proverbial steps. A few hundred years later, and not without the help of a few modern evangelical Christians citing loosely interpreted phrases from the Bible, and the town where the dead push bricks instead of daisies still stands. This unique custom can make for some interesting experiences growing up in this town. For example, my senior year's next table classmate was the grave of Jeff Rollins, a kid who croaked in class due to a rare type of aneurysm. Only a gravestone was placed. The body was cremated due to lack of adequate burial space. Our local convenience store has a grave in the middle of the frozen goods aisle, so if you're after ice cream and an instant dinner, you have to go around the back. And so on. It's almost crazy to think that hundreds of years of maintaining this bizarre practice led to me having this conversation with Claire. Says you. She went on. I think it's important. And in any case, you have to admit it's pretty disturbing. As much as I hated to admit it, it was pretty disturbing. And I'm not talking about the murder. Even for a non-religious, non-traditional man such as myself. If I exercised the practice, it was only to fit in. The idea of desecrating our tradition so blatantly seemed plain wrong, just like an individual with no passion for the arts would be troubled at the sight of a man taking a shit on the Mona Lisa. And you know how they found the victim this time? Claire continued. He must have killed her somewhere in the house, but the police found her in the shed, with her stomach open and her insides. Claire, I really don't want to hear this, I said. I was already starting to feel nauseous. How fucked up is that though, huh? I wonder what her family's going to do now. Like, where do they bury her? Claire changed lanes to avoid the final resting place of Emily Rogers, whose transgressions against roadside etiquette earned her an honorary spot at the library junction. No idea. I let out a yawn as we finally pulled up next to an old Victorian-style home. Well, that's me. Thanks for the ride, see. No problem, said Claire as I stepped out of the car and onto my porch. I turned back to wave at my friend, who gave me a smile and wink, then drove off. Damn. Mom, I'm back, I said out of habit as I stepped through the door into the large living room. Reality descended on me for the millionth time. My mom has passed away this summer, 5 years after my dad. The sight of an empty home still depressed me every time I walked in. Well, almost empty. Hey, Coco, I said and gave my cat a pat on the head, who meowed to let me know her bowl was empty. There's one thing that's sure about serial killers. Their appetite becomes harder and harder to satisfy as time goes on. As such, we didn't have to wait a full month before the next incident occurred. Check the paper, Claire said one morning in between sorting letters. There was another one last night. And guess who spotted him? Well, I said, trying to focus on what little desire I had to live as I was sorting the 100th letter of the day. You wouldn't believe. It was Aunt Betty, exclaimed Claire. From Sloane Street? I asked incredulously. And indeed, the paper had a jumbo-sized, and not quite flattering, photo of the old woman juxtaposed against a shadowy outline with the eye-popping caption "Mysterious Killer Spotted." As it turned out, Aunt Betty, who was no one's aunt in particular, couldn't sleep during the night, a standard case of old person insomnia. She decided to entertain herself by looking out the window, from which she saw a man dressed in black carrying poor Gregory to the backyard. Once again, the killer did not disappoint with his particular flair for the macabre. Gregory Peel, the third victim to date, was abandoned unceremoniously on the steps of his porch as the perpetrator fled the scene. However, the large wooden cross found in the backyard, stolen from a church a few weeks prior, suggested that our hero was planning a theatrical reenactment of the greatest tragedy in the history of mankind, with the Son of God as a bald man in his 50s. Aunt Betty managed to get a look at the man before he vanished, and she swore up and down that when the man raised his head to look at her, he had nothing underneath his hood, just a dark abyss, like death itself. Granted, the old woman was pushing 90 and her eyesight was already packing its bags, but the dramatic tone added just the right flavor to a best-selling edition of the Town Herald the morning after. And that's how the Faceless Man was born. Needless to say, the press had a field day with the news and reiterated for the 100th time the killer's modus operandi: break into their homes, stab them or slit their throats, clean up the blood so the place of death is unidentifiable and move the bodies to another room. Mortimer Snyders of Mort's Funeral Home also gave an interview and spoke on the moral and cultural decline of our youth. Needless to say, the police's inability to locate the actual place of death and allow for proper burial made people very uncomfortable. Jesus fucking Christ on a bicycle, I exclaimed as I finished reading the article, without failing to draw a judgmental gaze from an old man who was vigorously licking a stamp in one of the booths. Yeah? Crazy, huh? She lives just a few blocks over from me. I've been double locking my doors every night. It's a good thing I have Dave with me to keep me safe. Dave was a gigantic Great Dane. Claire affectionately called him her Great Dave to my not-so-great amusement, who would bark at the slightest disturbance to the house. I never liked that dog, but boy did I feel grateful for him then. Maybe you should install a security system. You can never be too safe, I said, emphasizing the concern in my tone. Maybe you should install a security system, she replied cheerfully. Maybe I should. If I wasn't as broke as a church mouse, I thought to myself. Her concern was touching, though. Such a pure-hearted person is hard to come by. Not to mention her wit and her mesmerizing eyes, and oh my god, I hate being a wimp. Okay. All done for the day. Ready to go? I realized I was staring at her and snapped back to reality. Yeah. Thanks, dude. I really appreciate the ride, I said. Hey, you got it, man, she said with a wink. The months following the passing of my mother went by in a big and unexciting blur. The monotony of my life has not changed, but over time I have started to gradually get over her death. Admittedly, my coping mechanism was somewhat horrible. Binge-watching shows on Netflix, emptying bottles of ye olde liquid strength, and there are other activity lonesome men tend to engage in. The slow passing of the weeks was punctuated only by the sporadic murders, which were closely followed by the town's increasing anxiety and interest in the faceless man, and home security products, whose killing pattern emerged through his activities. 2 weeks went by before the fourth victim was found, her throat slit and positioned to sit on the couch with the TV turned to static, and then another 2 weeks before the fifth was discovered, the details of his death too gruesome to put in writing. I will, however, mention that they involve a misplaced appendage. It became increasingly clear what the killer was after: attention. The morbid and sophomoric sense of humor, meme culture to be blamed, and rashness of the killings allowed the police to release a profile of the killer to the press, who asked the general public to look for a boy in his late teens or early 20s, who answers the following characteristics: a misanthrope who is at odds with his parents, an underachiever at school or work, a loner with no friends and a cynical approach to life who finds amusement at another's misfortune. If that sounds familiar, it's because the description fits at least 90% of the teenagers on this planet, and I am willing to bet my entire life's savings that if there's some other race living in a distant galaxy far away, it applies to their teenagers, too. The slow crescendo of violence and the profane nature of the crimes instilled a sense of unease in all inhabitants, and the police's incompetence and inability to slow down the killing spree certainly did not inspire a sense of security in anyone. The lingering sense of danger permeated everyday life like a poisonous miasma. At that time, even Claire's happy-go-lucky attitude seemed to darken ever so slightly, as if she could sense that sooner or later, the slow build-up of tension would culminate in an ominous final act. A month has passed since the fifth victim was found, and the dreadful anticipation for the next incident seemed to be on everyone's minds. Except, of course, no one ever thought it was going to happen to them. Truly, humanity's greatest strength is our ability to believe that we are immune to danger. Either that or I was just not that concerned for my well-being. Not to mention that the monotony of my life made me feel less like a person and more like a robot. I did, however, care for my cat, so when I heard her meowing one night, I groggily stepped out of my bedroom and made my way downstairs to fill her bowl. The house felt exceptionally dark that night. The moonlight shone through the windows and the trees cast long and ominous shadows. The carpeted floor did not make a sound as I tiredly made my way downstairs. I lazily slid my hand across the handrail and scanned the dark living room as I walked down the stairs. I became increasingly aware of the silence as I walked down, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I finally reached the bottom of the stairs and entered the kitchen. I snapped out of my dreamlike state as I realized that the dark kitchen was not empty. A man stood on the other side of the kitchen, towards the back door, and froze when I spotted him. He was about 6 feet tall and very thin. He must not have been older than 18. Under his hood, he wore a black balaclava that exposed only the eyes and mouth. My mind whispered to me the truth I didn't want to acknowledge. I recognized the man from the description in the paper. Except, of course, he wasn't an otherworldly ghoul. He was just a kid. The most captivating detail of his character was, however, the sharp, silver, metallic commando knife he carried in his right hand. We looked at each other, and I immediately knew what was going to happen. In the movies, they always show the fight scenes in slow motion. They don't tell you how fast it happens in real life, how the killer lunges at you like a panther in the jungle. By sheer luck I managed to react and avoid getting stabbed in the heart, instead of feeling the warmth on my left arm, with the pain registering quickly after. I scrambled to the counter and the faceless man lunged again. At that moment, I suddenly realized I didn't want to die. All of my feelings, desires, and want to be flashed before my eyes like a kaleidoscope. I thought of all the things I won't be able to do and was immediately filled with immense regret. I knew, sure as death, that I am not going to survive this encounter. I closed my eyes and braced for the worst. Instead, I was met with the crunching sound of a kneecap smashing against a concrete slab of stone. I opened my eyes to see the man stumbling and, miraculously, falling neck first into the business end of his own killing apparatus. I caught a glimpse of the one thing my would-be killer didn't account for, a gravestone with the inscription R.I.P. Meredith Tucker, beloved mother and friend, neatly positioned in the middle of the kitchen. As everything went black, I managed to whisper a final thank you to my mom. I guess all moms do care for their sons, no matter where they are. A neighbor who heard the commotion called the cops, who arrived at the scene to find me passed out, and covered in my own sickened urine, a detail the police have thankfully omitted from the official report. The irony of the killer finding demise at his own tool was only overshadowed by his failure to account for the very thing he was protesting against. I would later find out the faceless man was not a nameless man. His name was Alvin Jefferies, a fact I would be reminded of every time I stepped into the town's one and only double-graved kitchen. The investigation would also reveal him as a deeply troubled kid, who was traumatized by having to sleep in the same room as his dead father. His deep hatred for our custom, coupled with childhood trauma and a possible undiagnosed personality disorder, propelled him into a downward spiral of madness. The details would appear in the paper, making me a local celebrity for exactly 1 week, until everyone moved on to the next big thing. In the morning after the event, I woke up in the hospital with a bandage on my arm. They ran all sorts of tests and concluded I was fine, despite a lovely scar on my left bicep. I couldn't be happier to see Claire sitting on the chair beside my bed when I woke up. When she saw I'm awake, she hugged me tightly, and I could feel warm tears on my cheek. I couldn't tell if they were mine or hers. "Maybe tradition isn't so bad after all, huh?" she said. I managed a weak grin. "Maybe not." She pulled away and held my hand tightly without saying a word, and for a moment, I sensed something deeper than concern for a friend in her smile. Maybe I do have a chance.